Hello,
Yeah.
and welcome to episode 21 of Creative Dynamos. I have here with me tonight my guest, Jay Requard, and Jay and I have known each other through the wonder that is Facebook for quite a while.
hmm
And I've been eager to get you on here because you are a creative dynamo. You are a prolific author, and you have had a journey that when I first launched this thing, I saw you post about your transitioning into the indie sphere, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But ever since I saw that, I was like, yeah, I can't wait till I get a chance to talk with Jay about that. But before we get into the meat of tonight's discussion, tell us a little bit about how long you've been a writer and what got you started as a writer.
Well, I fell in love with fantasy at 9. I just started naturally reading it, and my first loves were, of course, Le Guin. I think Patricia McKillip was a big influence for me. But when I was 11, my dad gave me a copy of The Hobbit, and of course, I was kind of locked in from there. I didn't really start writing until I was 19, and what convinced me to start writing was Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard. I
Nice.
love those stories, but it was also those stories were very accessible and made me realize that if I put the time and effort into it, I could write something as good as those Conan stories.
Oh yeah.
Um, and from there, since the time I was 19, I've been steadily working on my craft. I went to school for history and religious studies, but I supplemented a lot of that with creative writing courses, English courses, and just since I'm about to turn 40, so about 20 years in, I'm just really dedicated to the craft of writing fantasy, and fantasy in particular. I blog as well. I do stuff on YouTube. I host and produce my own content, but for me, my passion has always been writing the fantastical. I tell people swords, dragons, magic. That really is my thing, and it's something that I love doing, and will probably be doing until the day I croak, if God willing, and I'm blessed to do that. It's something that I found in life that I realized that I don't ever have to quit. I've lived a life where I've had to quit a bunch of things for various different reasons, and fantasy is one of those things that is always there for me, and I'm always trying to be there for it in a sense. Like, if you really want to know me at my core, I love fantasy fiction, whether it's books, TV, music, anything involving fantasy. I want to see flourish, I want to see better, and I want to see authors, musicians, artists, everyone involved with the genre um, get better as well and have more recognition and success. I think that everyone loves this genre because it is tied to human mythology, and we all have this tie to human mythology, whether we like it or not sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think fantasy is the kind of continuation of that human myth. We still talk about the stories that made us as individuals, as communities, as civilizations. And I think the work that we do in fantasy, while not as maybe foundational as it is to society like it used to be, I think it's still such a worthy exercise that we're telling these kind of fantastical stories because we're holding on to a little bit of the magic that I think makes life. I You caught me because I always go a little too far in terms of describing my love of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing about it really is, I think science fiction helps us explore the material world around us.
Right.
I really do think that fantasy and horror, to a large extent as well, helps us explore the internal world within us.
Yeah.
And I think that all of those kind of, and science fiction can do that as well. There's, especially in the last few decades, there's been some really great science fiction that explores consciousness. But I think fantasy in general has become my passion and kind of the medium through where I focus my worldview through, um, because it's just always had this natural resonance with me. So that's really why I write it, why I continue to write it, and why I'm here now.
Well, and I think I think you almost said that maybe, or maybe you did say that myth making is maybe not as important as it used to be. Um,
Right.
I would push back on that because I think that myth making is still a vital part of the human experience. We're going to touch on this in a little bit
Mhm,
too, but we're going to talk about professional wrestling because we're both fans of
mhm.
professional wrestling. That's myth making in the 21st
Yes.
century. You know,
Yes.
that's fantasy. Uh,
Yes.
I
Absolutely.
hate to break it to some of you fans out there, but wrestling ain't real.
It's
Um,
predetermined, folks.
I mean, it's real. It is real, but
Yes,
it is
but
real
predetermined.
athleticism. It's real sportsmanship. But it's usually a predetermined outcome. So, uh, yeah, and myth making in our politicians, myth making in our movie stars, and all of all of our experience of humanity is still very vital.
May I,
Um,
may I, may I push back on that just a little bit?
sure, please.
I think the difference in our modern times, I agree with you that myth making still has great importance. I think with the advent of some of the technology that we have, especially digital technology, I think with some of the new mediums that people are working on, I think myth in itself and storytelling in itself is going to dovetail in some very interesting ways in the future where I think William Gibson kind of touched on it in Neuromancer a little bit
Hmm.
at some point when we start to integrate digital technology into ourselves in a more profound way than we are now, and I've actually seen this personally happen in the last few years, I think that we are going to embark on a completely new era of storytelling.
Hmm.
And, I kind of look at it like Star Trek. I think the holodeck, for example, in Star Trek,
Mm.
is one of those things that makes the next kind of evolutionary leap in
Hmm.
terms of where humans go with narrative, where we go with our myths, where we go with the exploration of ourselves in the outer world. I think a lot of people expected things like in the 90s, 80s, and 90s. I think people thought virtual reality was going to do that.
Hmm.
I think to a certain extent, people thought augmented reality during the 2010s, the early 2020s was going to lead to that.
Hmm.
I think where we're going with AI in particular is going to maybe not change fundamentally how we tell stories, but it will create new avenues and new methods of telling story once we get past the giant legal and ethical hurdles that it
Yes.
obviously has.
Yes.
But I think that that's an inevitability in itself too. That
Uh,
like at some point it will be involved in storytelling, and once that happens, I don't know what that looks like.
it's funny you say that. Does the name J.C. Hutchins mean anything to you?
A little bit. There's a little bit of familiarity with that. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't always remember where my relationship tree tracks. But JC was one of the original podcast novelists,
Hmm.
and he was somebody who leveraged to a certain degree of success the early podcasting boom into some publication success. And he recently put up a storytelling experiment on LinkedIn involving AI and storytelling, and it was really cool. And I think that it was uh, just the barest glimmer of, I think, the kinds of things that we'll see moving forward. I think when the technology catches up
Hmm.
to where our imaginations, if that's ever possible,
Yeah.
are
Yes.
capable of going, um, then I think that, yeah, we'll definitely see some interesting things if we live to see that. If not, then the generations to come will see that um, for sure. Um,
Agreed.
and I think that that's this this kind of conversation is exactly why I started this podcast, because I want to talk about this kind of stuff. We talked about I say we, not you and I, but the community at large of writers and creators that I have known for the past almost 20 years used to call what we did new media.
Hmm.
Because podcasting was at that point new media, and YouTube, and leveraging technology in storytelling. And it still is new because we still are kind of exploring the boundaries of what we can do with self-publishing, indie publishing, whatever we want to call it. Um, and I think the problem is a lot of us, myself included, are still thinking in a very old media kind of way, even when we are using new media. Like we aren't using this new technology to its fullest potential. And I'm not talking about having AI write the story for us, because
Hmm.
that's never a good thing.
No.
But using technology to help us tell our
Hmm.
stories yeah is something we're still figuring out, I think. And just
Well, I
yeah, go ahead.
I think we really have to get around the moral and ethical hurdle still,
Yeah.
and that is really the biggest kind of hurdle to get over at the moment. We I think economists and kind of the market engineers and the captains of industry keep talking about the AI bubble from a financial perspective, but I don't think that we're talking about the AI bubble from a creative perspective in a sense. There's been kind of a whole hog adoption of these tools, and I know this directly in New York publishing, that AI has kind of proliferated everywhere
Mm-hmm.
with these kind of big corporate conglomerate media structures. And the problem is it's been rolled out so quickly that they haven't really figured out what to do with it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And what they are doing with it has diminishing returns. And part of that is because, the slopification is a real thing. If you just keep taking people's data and just processing it over and over and over again, you're just going to get garbage.
Yeah.
The need to have authors, artists, voice actors, actors, people who are creating original content, which I think is sometimes a difficult word, but
Mm-hmm.
creating original media, creating new art, new books, new things for us to enjoy and ponder about in our lives. Um, I think that that is still such a vital thing that we need, and we're definitely watching a lot of these companies put the cart well before the horse,
Yes.
and and completely forgetting like, hey, we need to find a reliable horse first that actually makes all of this work, and for it to work, it's us creatives. But if we're cut out of the conversation from the very beginning, like we have been,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's never going to go anywhere positive. Which is why I'm a big supporter of like George R. R. Martin finally going after OpenAI, because there's obvious proof that they probably pirated his books and used it to create I think they used it to create a novel that is a facsimile of Dance of Dragons, or I think the sixth or seventh book.
Mm.
Yeah, the sixth or seventh book. So, we really just have to get over this kind of event where I think the worst people right now are obviously in charge of the AI sector. I think we all see that. And I think we all
Mm-hmm.
kind of feel that too. I mean, when Sam Altman says he doesn't do anything to raise his baby alone without consulting ChatGPT, like there's something fundamentally wrong there. Like, you can't hand the human experience and large swaths of the human experience off to a digital assistant and expect that assistant to perform as well as a human. Like,
Yeah.
it's just not going to happen, and we're not there. But we have this society, we kind of have this kind of social engineering here in America where if we let enough corporations get enough power and they hope and dream hard enough, we'll follow their hopes and dreams right off of a cliff. And then, of course, we're going to sit around afterwards and say, well, why did we end up jumping off the cliff? And who told us to jump off the cliff? And the people that survived the cliff jump will be like, well, listen to us. We survived the cliff jump, so we'll be able to tell you how to survive the next cliff jump.
Yep.
But but we're all jumping off cliffs. Like at some point, there's a real diminishing return to that. And I think the moment when we finally pull back from AI and decide that we're not going over these cliffs anymore, I think that's the moment where you'll finally see this flourish. But it's a real hurdle, and I don't think it gets solved this year. I don't think it gets solved in the next 3 years. I think certain things have to happen, unfortunately, like a change of the administration.
Mm-hmm.
I think, unfortunately, we're probably going to have an AI-related disaster.
Yeah.
And not just the AI bubble popping, like something really wrong happening at some place like Meta or Amazon, well, in that case, Anthropic. But it just feels like, the way things are going right now with this new tool or these new tool sets that are being developed and deployed, there's really not a mindfulness or a thoughtfulness behind it. And until we get there, we have to make do with the best we can.
And I think that there's potential for us to get there in small ways sooner than that. Like I know that there are a lot of smart people out there who are
Mm-hmm.
building smaller AIs, and who are doing purpose-built tools to do things with. And while I'm in the IT sector, it's such a big world. I don't know. I don't have any examples that are pertinent to creativity, but I just know that there've got to be some people out there who are creatively minded, who are doing small indie projects, building their own models, and who are doing things the right way. But they don't get the spotlight because it's not as exciting or as horrible as the stuff that is going on, and with the large language models and things like that, which we definitely need to keep our eyes on, because there's so much power in the hands of the people that control those, and there's so many resources tied up with those. We don't want to lose sight of what's being done with them. But yeah, I'd like some light cast on people that are doing good things with this technology, because I know they're out there.
Right.
So anyway, so one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on was for you to talk about your journey from being a traditionally published author to being an independently published author. So, first of all, how did you get to be traditionally published in the first place? What did that look like in your case?
So that is a fascinating journey, because I got into the business right after. I would like to say I got into the business around 2011, but around that time, digital publishing had really caused massive changes already to the bookmaking and the book publishing landscape. You were already seeing big box stores closing, like Barnes & Noble and Borders. Before Barnes & Noble had their huge resurgence, I think people forget there was a 15-year period where they were losing money every year to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, Borders shut down as well. But in focusing on kind of the shutdown of Borders and Barnes & Noble, we forget that Walden Books shut down. A lot of the mid-tier and mid-list bookstores, especially in malls and airports, got shut down. And for a long time, we've had to deal with Amazon, and we're still dealing with Amazon.
Oh, just a second. For some of our younger listeners, a mall is
Yes.
a large building where there were lots of smaller buildings inside of where you could buy things. So, kind of like Amazon, but in physical stores.
Back when capitalism was cool, we had this temple we went to.
Yes. Oh my God, that's such a good example. That's such a good comparison.
Yeah. But I came into this basically on publishing short stories in traditional outlets. And some of those were tokens, some of those were semi-pro. Early on, I had one sale that was a pro sale for an anthology that kind of went nowhere. But I did a lot of short story publishing, and I think short story publishing is a great way for any author to break in.
Yes.
And I still think it is. I think the market's changed a little bit, but back then, you could really make connections and meet people by publishing short stories. And I was able to do that, and I got in touch with someone by the name of Sam Montgomery Glenn, who was the publisher of Bull Spec magazine in Durham, North Carolina. And Bull Spec only went for about 11 issues, but for a while they had one of the best sci-fi and fantasy publications on the market. High gloss covers, great articles, great short fiction, just fantastic. But through Sam, I was able to meet a lot of great authors, a lot of great editors, publishers. I went to my first Dragon Cons, which were a really important turning point in my career where I was able to make connections. And around that time, John Hartness, Jane Gates, and I kind of were going through this process of looking at publishers at the time, because I was trying to shop novels and I was trying to shop short story collections. And I entered a period of publishing where there was this really big push for diversity, which was really important. It's still really important at the time, especially now since a lot of publishers are pulling back from it. I also entered at a time where the technological shift from traditional print and paperback books to ebooks was really taking place. So my first publishing contract was with a small publisher out of Apex, North Carolina, which is my hometown, called Big City Press. They bought a novel from me called The Night, which at the time was a vampire fantasy. And this was the time when Twilight was really popular and there was a lot of vampire fiction on the market. I essentially wrote a novel that was... did you ever read Crimson Reign? It's a Batman comic book. Yes. Basically vampire Batman in a fantasy city. That was my first novel, and unfortunately the publisher folded right literally the week before the novel came out. I learned a lot of valuable lessons from that. But from that failure, I was able to meet new people, including John and Jane. And at some point, we all got together and decided that John was going to start Falstaff Books, and Jane was going to be one of the editors, and I was going to be one of the first authors they signed. The first contract they ever handed was to me for my Monway the Panther stories. They took 9 of the stories that I had and collected them all in one volume that became Thief of Destiny. And that was my first kind of traditional publishing credit. And the beauty of Falstaff at the time was John formatted the contracts in a way where we were giving people, or they gave me elements of a publishing deal that at the time people thought were like crazy, like 50% on the ebook, 50% on the print, and then I believe like you kept your audio rights, which was unheard of at the time. They didn't have right of first refusals in those contracts. For people who are really young, who are now getting into the publishing game, there used to be something in a publishing contract called right of first refusal, where a publisher, if they weren't interested, let's say you publish your first book and your second book, and the first book does well, but the second book doesn't do as well, and the publisher doesn't want to put out the money for the third book. Well, they sometimes have something in a contract called a right of first refusal, where they can say, well, we need to read whatever you write next in this series, and we have a right to say no to it first or yes to it first. And for a long time, those were kind of bad contract situations because if a publisher had a vendetta or there was a management shift or so many things that can happen to a publisher, and you've experienced this too. That right of first refusal could really hold up people's careers in some cases. John got rid of that from the contract. And that was really important for me because I was able to go and shop other books, other places that he wasn't interested in. And I was able to get into ghostwriting for a little bit at the time. Of course, I've signed some NDAs, so I can't really talk out loud about who I'm for, but I was able to use the traditional publishing experience I had through Falstaff to get into ghostwriting and then get into some editing here in New York City as a contract employee for some of these larger publishers. And over time, I kept publishing more books with John. and I started publishing a few more books that unfortunately never got published with other publishers because, again, things happen in publishing.
Yeah.
And most of my publishing career has been with small publishers, which I think is not unique anymore.
No.
But back in the day, it was unique, where people would look at you if you had a small publisher and kind of make you feel like you were an indie author, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense where that's really not the case anymore. There's so many successful small publishers, including Falstaff Books, that have done really well for themselves and have really built audiences and have really kind of leveraged the digital shift in publishing that we've seen. Um, Around, I would say, 2018, however, I kind of realized, and at the urging of John too, that to be a successful author, I think now in today's marketplace, you really do have to be a hybrid author.
Mm-hmm.
And I had picked up so many tools working for Falstaff. I was first an author for them, and then John hired me as a business manager, and then he hired me on as an editor.
Mm-hmm.
And during that period where I served as an editor, I really learned a lot about bookmaking and how to put together a book, how to get cover art, all the things you need to be a bookmaker, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided I was going to write a manuscript that I was going to submit to Self-Publishing Fantasy Blog Off, which is this huge contest that Mark Lawrence, a very famous fantasy author, puts on every year. And I was going to write a manuscript, and I was going to basically put together my first book by myself. And that novel became Atinia. And Atinia did, I thought, pretty well in the contest for my first indie novel. And from there, I kind of started fully transitioning away because as much as many benefits as there are to traditional publishing, in today's modern publishing landscape, there are a lot of detriments now to it.
Yeah.
And one of the key ones is time. It takes way too long, in my opinion, for a traditional publisher to get a book out. And people like Christopher Rakuccio, who's a really successful sci-fi author, had recently talked about this, where publishers don't even really look at what they're going to be putting out in terms of theme or genre. They really kind of look at it from a calendar perspective. What am I going to be doing in 6 months? What am I going to be doing in 12 months? Well, in 6 months to 12 months, people's taste can vary wildly.
Sure.
But for a publisher, they're kind of stuck on this kind of production model where these are the books on our slate that we signed. These are the books that we have to put out. And this is what we're going to do, and however long it takes, and some of that is in involvement with the author, it could be really slow and really plodding. I also think that there's some things that traditional publishers did in the last 10 years especially that have made their status as a solid basis for an author career kind of questionable.
Mm-hmm.
Not only with some of their recent implementations of AI into the production of books, but also some of their hiring practices, some of their employment practices. I would also have to mention that when I got into traditional publishing, there wasn't a single book that didn't have typos throughout the manuscripts. Like, we went through a plague of typos that people kind of forget,
Mm-hmm.
but it was endemic to everywhere in publishing, where for a while, like, there was just no effective proofreading going on. I think now you have so many tools and you have so many people involved in the indie publishing landscape that for a relatively nominal amount of money, you can go and have a book that you put together that looks just as good as any book that you will find on the shelf of Barnes & Noble or a large independent bookstore or a convention, anywhere. The playing field between traditional publishers and indie publishers has, for the most part, been level. The only thing that separates us really, and that this is changing too, I think, is the distribution models.
Yeah.
But in some cases, while the distribution model is changing in ways for indie authors that are good,
Mm-hmm.
it's also changing in ways that are bad for both traditional publishers and indie publishers.
Okay.
So there's kind of and I have real concerns about this. I think about this a lot. It's one of those things that keeps me up. Um, I I think it's wonderful that we all have this passion to publish books because we all fell in love with books. We all fell in love with story. But at some point, we really do have to look at the state of the industry and wonder why there are so many more authors and equally more readers than ever before. But there's no money in necessarily being an author like there used to be, especially in like the 90s. If we talk about the money people used to make in the 90s versus today,
Mm-hmm.
completely different worlds, like astronomically different worlds. I had a friend recently who had their manuscript go up to auction, and that used to be a
It's a big
really big
deal. Yeah.
deal. Um, I think without giving away too much, she got essentially like 90K
That's
from
not
from
much.
that's not much, but like Terry Goodkind got like $150 million
Right.
for Wizard's First Rule, and that guy was a douchebag. Like, you know, there was you didn't even have to be that great of a person to nail a big deal
Well, it's
that
not. It's not.
that
Sadly, it's not important what kind of person you are.
yeah, but interesting, I think now it kind of is
Yeah.
because well,
That things have
social media,
changed. Things have changed in that direction too.
yes. And but I think fundamentally a question that every author, every publisher, every editor, and everyone involved in bookmaking has to ask now is what is the real health of the industry? And while I think there are certain things happening in the industry that are very good, like the rise of bookshop.org, other independent bookstores finally getting online and trying to make a play for it, we really need antitrust legislation against Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I've spent years talking about this with other authors and publishers and editors, years, trying to figure out a way like, okay, what's something we can do as authors and editors and publishers to kind of either meet them halfway or get around the challenges they present to us? And unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that the only way we really fix the Amazon problem and make publishing equitable again for everyone involved is unfortunately going to have to be antitrust legislation.
Yeah.
Amazon owns too much of a monopoly on the publishing business, especially digital publishing, that unless something's really done about it, I don't mean to be a doomsayer because I think things can be done about this, and I think that authors can be very pivotal in getting this done, as we're seeing right now with OpenAI. Um, I think that that's the big fight for not only our scene in genre fiction, but for every scene in publishing and outside of just books, music, video, movies, film, everything. I really do think that like that's the fight on our hands
Right.
more than anything else.
And I think antitrust is a big part of that. I think also, what encourages me is seeing creators come up with alternatives because
Yes.
the big deal, like whenever I hear somebody say, oh, this sucks or that sucks, is, well, what's our alternative? Well, let's come up with an alternative. Like, there's a guy that I follow on Threads, and he's coming up with an alternative to ACX.
Mm-hmm.
And you know there's like, for YouTubers who want to create these videos that are not, cramped down by YouTube's algorithm and stuff. They created, oh shoot, what is it? I see commercials and stuff on YouTube for it all the time. Um, my brain's not braining. But basically, they created a service, a subscription service, a different platform for YouTubers to come together and create videos where
Mm-hmm.
they can do whatever they want, and people can pay uh, their favorite YouTubers to make content that they want to make. and they're not being forced. They're not being forced by YouTube's algorithm to make the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that they think will float to the top. I mean, they still have to do that to a degree, but they at least have an alternative. So yeah, that's the other thing, is coming up with leveraging technology, leveraging the stuff that's out there and our creative spirit to come up with alternatives to the Amazons. And yes, it's a drop in the bucket. I hear people
Mm-hmm.
saying, your fingers are furiously typing me emails saying, but Scott, that's nothing compared to what Amazon, whatever. Yes, you're right. Which is why I said I agree that antitrust lawsuit needs to be brought against
Yeah.
Amazon,
Well,
because
I
it
think it happens in our lifetimes. I really do. I
yeah.
actually think that there are people, especially I'm a big fan of Lena Khan. I live in New York City, and she is the former head of the FTC. She's joining Zoran Mamdani's team here in New York as he transitions into mayor. But Lena Khan, I think, is one of those people that is going to be one of those voices and one of those figures that emerges here in the next 10 to 15 years, where we actually see people start to take on these big, massive conglomerates, especially in places like media, especially now because I think we're all watching the Netflix Warner Brothers debacle go on, and
Speaking of huge
yeah,
conglomerates, yeah.
well, like it's just I think for everyone at home listening to this and everyone outside in the real world, I think it's very obvious what's going on here. Like this is getting too big, and I talk to people on the left and right who feel this way too. That like these things are just getting too big, and I think at some point a critical mass, hits, and it's open season.
Yeah, yeah, it's too big to fail. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
No such thing.
No such thing. No such. If history has taught us anything, there's no such thing. Um, so now you're in the process of continuing to go more and more indie, and I think I
Hmm.
saw something about you um, are in the process of getting some of your rights back, and
Hmm.
going to be making some stuff available in the new year. What's the process of getting your rights back been like? Has that been complicated? And because I
Uh,
think that's something that people who, again, might not know much about the minutia of publishing and contracts, that concept of getting your rights back may not be something that they're familiar with, but they should be conscious of if they're, you know, interested in going down that road.
right. I absolutely agree with that. The journey. So I recently got the rights back to two of my releases. The first one was Thief of Destiny, which I'm a big sword and sorcery fan, and I don't know if you read the genre, if anyone at home listening to your show reads the genre, but unfortunately, this last year we lost kind of a luminary in the scene, Howard Andrew Jones, unfortunately to brain cancer. And Howard was this brilliant author, brilliant editor, great all around human being. But one thing that I think that he doesn't get enough credit for, especially sword and sorcery, because you see it happening left and right now, is combination novels are really big again,
Mm-hmm.
where people are taking like short stories that feature one central character and rewriting them to tie them into one cohesive novel.
Hmm.
And that was something that was done during the 70s and 80s, especially in genre fiction. But he really tried to push it back with his Hanuvar series. And he did a great job, and it pushed me to go and get the rights back to Thief of Destiny, which I'm working on right now. It's been edited, and it's going through a few more editorial phases, but I'm also working with a great artist named Derek Eason, who is going to be doing the cover and the book wrap for it. And I'm really excited for how that book's going to look when it comes out, probably in August of 2026, so late summer. I also got the rights back to my first novella that nabbed me an award nomination for the Manly Wade Wellman, called War Pigs, which is an orc-centered sword and sorcery novella.
Nice.
Um, I love that book, and I recently finished doing the first editorial pass on it and realizing how much I love that book. again, because I hadn't looked at it for 10 years. Someone held the rights. At Falstaff held the rights for it for 10 years. So, it was really fun getting to open the book again and kind of go through and be like, okay, this is the stuff I like. This is the stuff that could have been tweaked a little bit better. Um, it is easy to ask for your rights back, especially when you have in your contract stipulations that say at any time you can ask for your rights back. I have to warn people, though, even though that's in my contract, it's not necessarily in every publishing contract today, even though there's been huge advancements in this. And there are a lot of great publishers out there that will give you your rights back, especially if they can't continue publishing your book. That happens a lot. Actually, that's some of the reason why a lot of publishers are existent today, because some people were able to get their rights back and they started new publishing companies based off that. But um, asking for my rights back has been easy. Getting them back has been a little bit harder, and a lot of that comes down to the administrative side of the publisher. They have to write documents and they have to generate material that says, like, these rights are back to you. And if something happens along the way, as they tend to do in publishing, it might take them a long, long time to get those rights back to you, even if it's just a simple email saying, hey, this is back to you now. It didn't take long for me to get the rights back to Thief of Destiny. Unfortunately, it took me a year of waiting after asking to get War Pigs back. And it took asking multiple times. So, it really depends on the kind of relationship you have with your publisher, too. I also have authors that are friends of mine who have agents that have dealt with reversion issues before. And really, my advice to anyone thinking about getting the rights reverted to them from a publisher, the first thing I would tell them to do is really understand your contract, really understand the bounds of it, understand what you can and can't do when it comes to rights reversion, because there's some things sometimes that you're just not getting back. Yeah. Like, you're never going to get the art from the original book. You're not going to get any of the ISBN numbers. So, like, you're going to have to go and repurchase the ISBN numbers yourself, which are expensive and a racket. A different podcast and a very different conversation. You basically have to start all over again. So, like, I always tell people when they think about reverting the rights, and I've had a lot of friends who've had their rights reverted recently, it's great to have your work back, but you need to have a plan before you do it. I went in with a plan of, okay, I'm going to ask for this back. This is what I'm going to do with it. This is the time it's going to come out in 1 to 2 years. I'm going to ask for this back. This is what I'm going to do with it. This is the plan for it. A lot of people get their rights back and then just sit on a book because they don't know what to do. One thing that I will tell every author I meet, even if they are experienced, even if they are hugely credited, it really matters if you know how to use something like Atticus or Calibri or Vellum. It really matters that you can put together your own ebook. It really matters that you know people that you can go and get relatively nominal proofreading or editorial from, and those can be your friends, but you need to understand that, like, you're building a little bit of a team. Yes. And you go out there and find people that you can trust to shepherd the book from what it was previously to what you want to see it be in whatever its next iteration is going to be. And, just like me transitioning from traditional publishing to independent publishing, there were a lot of steps I had to learn. And there's a lot of things that I had to go through. And there's a lot of mistakes I made. I mentioned that my first self-published novel was called Atenia. It took me 3 weeks from the time I uploaded it to Amazon to get it to the point where Amazon would even publish it. You have to go through the process of learning how to deal with Amazon's publishing system. Just like you have to learn the process of going through Smashwords' publishing system or whatever service you're going to be publishing through.
I had the wonderful experience of moving my books from Amazon to Ingram Spark
Ugh.
over the last few months because I wanted to get my books into a local indie bookstore,
Right.
and or for that matter, not just into that one bookstore, but into as many bookstores as I could.
Right.
And most bookstores won't take your book if it's published via Amazon. Some will do it on
Hmm.
consignment, but those are the exceptions and not the rule. So it's like I had to learn shit all over again, and I had to have some of my covers redone
Yeah.
because the same cover file that I uploaded for Amazon that worked great did not meet the specifications in every case. In some cases it did, but in every case it did not meet the specifications for Ingram Sparks cover design thingamajig. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's even when you think, like, I've been self-publishing for 15 years
Hmm.
roughly. I thought I knew what the hell I was doing. But as soon as I started to monkey around with Ingram Spark, I realized that that's a whole other animal. So yeah, um,
Well, traditional authors weren't taught this.
mhm.
We were never taught this ever. I, I,
And
I, I really try to stress this when I talk to younger authors today, in terms of like, they'll come up and talk to me and say, "Well, I know I've been able to format my ebook to do this, and I have my audiobook ready for this," and they just don't get that, like, they're in some way so far ahead of people that it's mind-boggling. Like, I really didn't know how to format an ebook until about 4 years ago,
mhm.
and now there's kids that click a button and they have their ebook formatted almost immediately. The process of going through it has changed so dramatically that I think people really still haven't had the whiplash effect. And I don't think we'll ever have the whiplash effect of it because the business has moved so quickly. But if you stop and think, you've been in this 15
Mhm.
years, just the changes that indie publishing has gone through in 15 years it's sometimes like magnificent, sometimes cataclysmic.
Yep.
Um, and there's always going to be another change,
Yes.
which is why it's so important as authors and publishers and editors that we keep re-educating ourselves.
Well,
That's something that really isn't taught for us.
and I am technically, and this is like this is something I have to clarify. Technically, I am a publisher, not just because I am an indie publisher, but because I have
Yes.
also published other people's words.
Right.
I have anthologies that I've published that contain other people's short stories. I have paid them. I have written contracts for them to sign, and I am thinking, and there are people that are trying to talk me out of this, of publishing somebody else's novel.
Hmm.
I don't have anybody in mind. I don't have a manuscript. I don't have anything right now except this stupid dream of publishing somebody else's novel. Um, and I have to think about things like, how am I going to treat their rights? How,
Hmm.
what rights am I asking for? How rights reversion? What am I going to pay them royalty wise? And I think about John, who is somebody that I'm always watching, like,
Hmm.
um, and other writers that have transitioned to publishers, to quote unquote real publishers, in the sense that they've published other people's stuff.
Uh,
Um, you know, and
I, I have to. I have a really controversial take about this. Um, we talk about traditional publishing and indie publishing. I think just in the last few years alone, especially post pandemic, I think sometimes we're clinging too hard to these ideas of indie and traditional.
mhm.
I'm not even sure that it really exist anymore. Just with the way things move now, it's very hard to, because there's so many indie authors who sign traditional deals because they were successful on the indie scene,
Mhm.
and there's so many traditional authors who leave traditional publishing and then find success on the indie scene
Mhm.
that, what do these terms really kind of mean anymore? I think about that a lot, but I'm sorry, you were saying,
No,
please
I think
continue.
those terms definitely. I think they still have some meaning,
Hmm.
but I think that what we have here is a spectrum,
Hmm.
rather than a dichotomy. Like, it really is, because I was talking with an author in an interview going back several weeks, and she works with a they're not a publisher, they offer publishing services.
Mm-hmm.
And so she uses the word hybrid differently
Mm-hmm.
than you used the word hybrid earlier. And so there's all kinds of language around all of these things, and I think that that can be helpful, and it can also be a hindrance sometimes. I
Mm-hmm.
use the phrase indie publisher to mean stuff. I publish my own stuff, but then there are publishers out there that call themselves indie publishers in the sense that they are small publishers. So yeah, it can all get very confusing.
Well, I, I one thing that I try to I want to verbalize this correctly because I think it can sound very confusing to people who can't see my face as I say it. Um, so I think when you look at certain publishers like Falstaff, or you look at Atheon Books, or you look at Dragonsteel Press, which is Brandon Sanderson's outfit, um, I'm not sure that the distinction between big publishers and small publishers and indie publishers versus traditional publishers is so defined anymore
It's not.
that and this is where so I agree with you that there is still on a macro level a traditional structure to the industry. Like I think if you have a book in Barnes and Noble or Books a Million or in one of the airport lounges or one of the bigger box indie stores, and I live in New York, so there's a bewildering amount of big box indie stores, which is both a positive and a negative. Um, I think small publishers have had such success over the last 2 decades that even the term big publisher versus small publisher, I will concede that the terms indie versus traditional still hold value. But kind of getting back to what I said about Amazon, who's really big versus who's really small when we're all having to really scrape it out on the same marketplace? I mean, I know big published authors who've sold no copies at a traditional publisher who've turned around and been able to sell 10,000 books
Mhm.
versus, indie authors who sold, thousands and thousands of books before they got their traditional deal and then didn't sell a copy afterwards. So like it's just a very weird environment to be in, and I know this is a lot of word salad on my end, but it sometimes feels like we're kind of in an ontological salad when it comes to publishing. Like, what is this thing really? What
Right?
does it
What is
really do?
publishing? Is when I put a story up on Substack, is that publishing? Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
yeah, there's a lot of man. It's a lot. Like people take a stance against self-publishing and then they go publish something on Substack or publish something on their
Right.
blog, and I'm like, you're self-publishing. Like that's self-publishing.
Well,
Um,
journalism now is primarily self-published, like
mhm.
serious
The good
journalism
stuff
out
is
there.
the good stuff is
It,
anyway.
it Yeah, but Substack in itself has become the news platform now for the internet in many ways that the New York Times or the Washington Post or the San Francisco Chronicle can't claim to have anymore. They have readerships that far dwarf those traditional publications.
Yes,
So like
100%.
that again, it becomes one of these things where it's like, what are we really talking about when we say big, small, traditional, indie? It's a very confusing mess
It is,
sometimes.
which is why I try and like whenever I talk about these kind of topics, I try and parse it out as much as I can without
Right.
like getting bogged down too much. But yeah, I consider myself just a publisher because
Right.
I've published my own stuff. I publish other people's stuff. I am a publisher, and that's one reason why I want to take the next step in my journey of publishing somebody else's novel because I think that would be a fascinating addition to my journey, and I think I have something to offer whoever that person ends up being if that happens. So yeah, I think yeah, that's um,
Yeah. I think that's completely plausible and completely doable. And I think there are, I'm a big fan of New Age Sword and Sorcery magazine, which is published now under Brackenberry Books, which is
mhm.
their publishing banner. They just kickstarted their first Sword and Sorcery novel, and it sold really well from the Kickstarter, and it's still moving well post Kickstarter now that it's actually out in the world as a published novel.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many different ways now to have successful novel launches and to get there that even with a small amount of money, it's possible. Like the beauty of the industry now, for all of the downsides that we can speak to it, there's still an opportunity to go out there and find readers and actually find an audience and actually do something that people don't expect. So I say go for it. And I think you should go for it. I think anyone should try their hand at it as long as they have a good plan. And it
Yes.
sounds like you want to have a good plan before you do it,
Yes.
which is the most important step in some ways, because there's so many people, unfortunately, and I see this all the time, especially in the book funnel community, which is kind of a plank now in the indie community in general.
Mm-hmm.
I see so many people put books out on book funnel that clearly didn't get any editorial. They clearly didn't get any cover design or any cover design input.
Mm-hmm.
Like as quick as easy as it is to publish now, it's also a detriment in terms of that ease because a lot of people move too quick.
Yeah.
So if you take your time, if you're thoughtful about it, especially when it comes to the cost of things, anything's possible. I mean, really, I used to be a critic of the Kickstarter method. For a number of years, I was a critic of Kickstarters or backer kit campaigns or whatever they were. I thought that they were anathema to publishing, honestly, and I thought that they were a sign that we were really having a downfall. I really changed my tune on that because I've been able to work with some publishers now that have actually shown me the numbers and the returns that they've made. Mm-hmm. I'm always willing to change my opinion and change my view if I'm presented with facts and evidence that are credible and rightfully sourced. Yes. And I've had to change my opinion on this one. I think that there are many viable, low-cost ways to have a very successful novel now. Yes. It's just putting in the work of putting that together, which in itself is an adventure.
It is. Yeah, I mean, you've got to have the right partnership. You've got to have a good plan. There's a lot of moving pieces. We've already come up to an hour.
Yeah.
And there's so much more I want to talk with you about. Let's keep going.
Yeah,
let's
please.
Keep going. So I had the pleasure of starting to read the first book in The Blessed and the Possessed.
Yes.
And this book is firmly in my wheelhouse. So, like,
I figured.
I have two characters that would get along famously with Father Patrick. Father Ian being one of them, and Willie Evans being another one. Father Ian is as a Catholic priest who solves spooky mysteries, and Willie Evans is a hedge wizard in a modern New Orleans setting, and he also kind of gets it in over his head with all kinds of strange happenings. So tell us a little bit about this series that you've got.
It's when the idea first came to me. So John Hartness at Falstaff Books wanted to do a series of Monster Hunter books based off of his successful Bubba the Monster Hunter series. Right. And one thing that he asked me to do was develop a Monster Hunter character. Well, me being the surly son of a bitch that I am, I went in the exact opposite direction, where I had been reading The Rite, which is this novel. I can't remember the author right now, but it's this nonfiction novel basically talking about the training of modern day Catholic priests in the rites of exorcism. Mm-hmm. And a movie was produced with it where Anthony Hopkins stars as one of the exorcists who is spoilers, taken over by Satan, and the young priest has to save the old priest, which is a great trope.
Yes.
It's a fantastic trope. But I was really fascinated by Catholic exorcism and just the kind of notions around it, especially coming from the I don't call myself an ex-Christian or a fallen Christian. I call myself a spiritual free agent, but I've always kind of had this affinity for Christ
Mm-hmm.
and the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually it became this question about, okay, if there is this God in the world and he in Catholic cosmology, God gives permission to all things. All things. There is nothing that happens in the world that does not have God behind it saying, yes, do that. No, do that. The wind blows this way today. The sun rises at this degree. God's in control of all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you stop and think about that from a moral and ethical perspective, possession gets into a really gray area where God is allowing demons to possess a person's soul on the auspices that the liberation of their soul will show God's glory to the world.
Yes.
And that is a problem, in a sense, if you have a modern thinking mind for a second.
Uh-huh.
And I really wanted to deal with that. And I wanted to deal with that with an exorcist, but not only an exorcist, a Catholic saint who's reincarnated. And I had been to Ireland a few times, and I had read so many books about St. Patrick, and I felt it was obvious to me that if you're going to have someone comment on the modern state of Christianity, on the modern state of the church, on kind of the modern state of belief, I think that I needed a Iron Age saint who lived a very different life in a very different church to be reincarnated into the modern world to make sense of it all. I came up with the idea of priests reincarnating. Well, I didn't come up with the idea. Historically, it's been seen before. During the Crusades, actually, there's multiple records of saints actually reincarnating throughout the Levant. It's fascinating, actually. So, traditional Orthodox Christianity holds this idea that reincarnation is just not happening. But during the Middle Ages, Catholics were fully embracing this idea that, I think one saint, I can't remember his name, but showed up twice during the First Crusade and then showed up again during the Third Crusade. And they were like, no, this is the same person reincarnated twice. So, the idea of reincarnation is not necessarily new to Christianity. It's been used before during the medieval period. There were some conceptions of it where you could argue that it's different from the Asian or the South Asian idea of reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still basically the same idea that these people are coming back and they have cognition of who they are and their purpose to God. And I thought Patrick would be a fascinating view into the modern world because I had spent a lot of time during my formative years reading about the Celtic Catholic Church, what the conversion of Ireland actually looked like, the difficulties of it. And I think the symbolism and what we know about the historical Patrick, too, paints this really fascinating figure of almost this charlatan who's clearly driven by something outside of him, but it's also, there's such a fantastic story to St. Patrick himself, from driving the snakes out of Ireland to knocking a rock out of Satan's mouth to, the conversion of pagans into early Christianity. I mean, there's myths that he may have been, and myths because we don't have any confirmations of these things.
Sure.
And Irish mythology and Christianity have a very interesting synthesis during the Middle Ages that I think we really take for granted sometimes, and it's a real synthesis. But he may have been involved in the formation of other Celtic gods turning into saints, which is something that happened in Irish Christianity, where they took the gods and literally made them into saints. I just thought that he was a fascinating person to look at and a fascinating person to express this story through and explore these kind of moral and ethical bounds. What I didn't expect by the third book, and a little bit of a spoiler, the question I eventually ended up having to ask is well, okay, what happens if Jesus Christ actually came back?
Ooh.
Came back head to toe, flesh and form. Because I've grown up in the South most of my life, and I grew up around evangelical Christianity most of my life. And You know this as I know this. A lot of evangelical Christians, even to this day, are positing that Jesus Christ is going to come back in some sort of physical form, which is not biblically accurate per se, and usher in this kind of paradise, which is
Mhm.
also not biblically accurate per se. Um, there's there's a tribulation,
Right.
and a lot of hard stuff happens between the good stuff and the end. Um, I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore that notion in the modern world. Like, what would we actually have to do if Jesus Christ just started walking around the streets of New York City? And you knew,
Hmm.
like, we all have this question as people of faith of why we believe and how we believe and the depths of our belief. Well, if you suddenly had your beliefs confirmed, it would be such a shock. I think it's almost as much as a shock when we talk about the question of aliens coming down and making first contact. What would that do in terms of our definitions of God and spirituality in the
Hmm.
universe? I think the same thing would happen if Christ showed up out of nowhere. And in fact, I think if Christ had to show up and commentate on the modern world, I think it would actually be a much more difficult journey for everyone involved, including the Almighty. Um, Especially now, it's funny that we're talking about this because just last week, one of the areas of the early church that I'm really fascinated in is the Arian controversy,
Uh-huh.
and and for those at home, I will try to keep this very very short.
For the
Um,
non-theology nerds.
yeah, um, there was a presbyter who's basically a scholar named Arius, who was part of the early Christian church. I think sometime around, my dates get muddy here, but sometime after 300 AD.
Hmm.
He ba- the early Christian church built this idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But it was underpinned by this thing called Neoplatonism, which held this idea that God is perfect. And if God is perfect, God can't change. Perfect things don't have to change. Well, the birth of Christ, the life of Christ, the death of Christ, and the resurrection of Christ are huge, obvious changes that clash with this idea of perfection.
Hmm.
And Arius went to a bunch of archbishops around at the time and said, like, look, I've really been thinking about this. I've really been looking at this. I'm a trained scholar. I'm not just anyone out of the woodwork saying this. We really need to deal with this problem. And it became a big problem for the early church that eventually leads to things like the Council of Nicaea and the affirmation of the faith that Christ, through the Trinity, is actually a perfect creation and a perfect being, and there's no conflict whatsoever. While this empire redefines and recasts Christianity for the next 2,000 years,
Right.
arguably. Um, I found that to be the most fascinating thing. And lo and behold, last week you have the Pope coming out, and I actually have some real respect for the new Pope, but lo and behold, here he comes talking about a new Arianism taking place where we can't talk about Christ as a historical figure. We have to talk about Christ as kind of this divine reality. And, 2,000 years later, we're still having debates about this. And I thought, like, well, if I'm to push the debate forward in these fictional books, we have to have the man in charge actually show up and answer some questions. And I take some shots at answering a few of those questions, which I know for some people at home hearing this sounds like the most amount of hubris someone can have. But I really looked at the Gospels. I think Christ actually explains a lot through parables.
Hmm.
I think the Book of John, especially the legalisms, really kind of articulate Christ's viewpoint. I think we have this idea that Christ is this mysterious philosopher in the modern world, that he was speaking cryptically through the Bible, and I just don't see that in the reading. If you're honest with it, there isn't really anything cryptic about what he's saying. He's very plain on the nose about a bunch of things.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
if he were to come back in the modern world and were to be as plain as he was then, now, I think it'd cause a lot of problems.
I think
And a
that
lot of big problems.
I think that the reason why the apostles had a lot of problems understanding what Jesus was saying is because they just didn't want to. They just didn't want to.
Yeah.
They didn't want to hear it. Um,
Well,
It was upsetting the apple cart.
Have you watched The Chosen?
I've watched the first couple of seasons.
So I find The Chosen fascinating
Hmm.
because on one hand, like it's trying to tell a story that I don't think we've seen presented in modern media
Yeah.
a lot. Like we don't ever really see the interaction of Christ and the disciples.
Hmm.
And one thing that I like about the show, I have some real criticisms about the show, but one thing I do like about the show is that a lot of the disciples are really struggling with what he says
Yeah.
and what he tells them to do and what he says is going to happen. And I think that that struggle is important to depict because even for modern believers of any faith, our struggle is a constant one. And
Yes.
it's one of sincere doubt and re-examination and recentering and reaffirming, but also sometimes deconstructing and
Hmm.
reconstructing something new. And I like that there's attempts to address that now, even though I think the show has some real passion issues to it.
Hmm.
There's some arguments that Christ is making to the community that he's in at the time
Hmm.
that are very modern
Hmm.
and are talking about things about purity that don't fit the modern conversation we have about purity, but also don't fit the conversations that ancient Jewish communities would be having about purity.
Hmm.
There's some real medievalisms in there still, which I think from the perspective of a religious studies scholar, I think you have to look at the medieval period of Christianity with a lot of nuance because in many ways the medieval period of Christianity is when things really start to twist themselves in very fascinating, sometimes some very distorted ways,
Yeah.
and
We
lead to
like we
things like the Reformation and
we still
things like
carry
that.
the images of hell that we carry with us are still basically from the Inferno, like
There,
fan fiction written by Dante.
there's a great book out there right now. I think his name is Brad Recker. He's from North Carolina. He's a former youth pastor,
Hmm.
but he wrote this really great book about how modern Christianity has this kind of escapist notion about hell and heaven, and the preoccupation with hell is actually um, anarch, not anachronistic. Sorry, that's the word I'm looking for. Anachronistic,
Anachronistic.
yeah, to what Christ and his disciples and the apostles would have been talking about. Like Christ really doesn't talk a lot about hell,
Hmm.
and didn't
Hmm.
really. If you really read the Gospels, doesn't really seem to have much of a fascination with it.
Hmm.
I mean, the
Hmm.
only time we deal with anything, Christ really deals with anything overtly evil is the temptation. And
Hmm.
even then, there's an argument, which I make in the second book, that the temptation itself is not necessarily overtly evil. Um, it's actually the character of Lucifer, to say the least, or the character of Satan, has also been redefined and
Oh,
recast so
for
many
sure,
times
for sure.
that like I don't think Christ, if he came back, would recognize the Satan that modern Christians talk about versus the one that he would have considered it in his heyday or his contemporary period.
Hmm. That's and like my own father Ian, like he wrestles with a literal demon, which is actually not a demon. It's ripped out of Irish folklore,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I, the ideas that we have of what demons are and what are all these different supernatural creatures and um, uh, he also in another story they encounter something that might be an angel. It might be a creature a creature out of Irish folklore. Um, when you get to this supernatural level of things, the lines start to get blurred, which is kind of why I'm fascinated by this character, Avidi,
Oh, Devi, yeah,
Devi,
the
um,
Nephilim, yes.
and the thing that I love about writing supernatural fiction like this, especially one that deals with Christian mythology, uh, is it lets us talk about these interesting and sometimes difficult concepts. Difficult in the sense of there's a lot of emotion attached to it. There's a lot of baggage attached to it, cultural baggage, and other things attached to it, and we get to engage with these things. And I actually talked with other previous guests just in general. I love how speculative fiction lets us talk about philosophical concepts, political concepts, religious concepts, whatever it may be, in a way that is a little less threatening than just writing an essay about it.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I'm really enjoying about this first book of yours is, and I'm just about maybe not even quite a third of the way into it. I'm just got to the point where St. George gets to the little house in the country and meets Dee
Right.
for the first time. And I love St. George, by the way. He's an asshole. But it's because he's convicted. He's just got this strong conviction, and that can often turn us into assholes.
You have to be to fight dragons. You
Yeah.
have to have a conviction to fight dragons.
Or whatever that dragon, whether it's a literal dragon or just something that's so much bigger than you are,
Right.
And so yeah, I love that you're engaging with this mythology. And I know there are people out there who are listening to this that don't like the fact that I attached the word mythology to the word Christian, but mythology doesn't mean it's not real necessarily.
Right.
So yeah, it's just having, I think, that kind of storytelling, where you are engaging with something that is kind of a hot button for a lot of people, but doing it in a way that is non-threatening, but still you're going some deep places with it. That's courageous.
Well,
on your part, I think.
thank you. And kind of focusing on Davy for a moment, one thing that I find really fascinating about the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is that there really is this kind of synthesis that we don't talk about a lot in biblical studies about the non-physical and the physical nature of God and God's creatures. Because, putting aside the wrestling with the angel, I believe that was Ezekiel. Putting that aside, Exodus is very clear that at one point servants of God come down to the earth and mate with women, and the line's just right there, the giants and heroes of the age. And I have always been so fascinated by that line because it means two things. First, if you look at Gnostic Christianity or just Gnosticism in general, Gnosticism holds this idea that there's this physical world that is this kind of illusion we all live in versus this kind of pure spiritual realm that God exists in. And some Gnostic traditions try to paint that Satan is the ruler of this world, this physical world, and God is the ruler of this more pure spiritual world. But the Bible does kind of with its Gnostic roots in some sense, because I think we all will acknowledge that the Bible obviously has some Gnostic roots to it. The idea of angels being able to mate with humans and a child being produced of that, such fertile storytelling ground that never gets touched on again at all, save, David and Goliath, who Goliath is arguably a Nephilim, maybe, but maybe, a child of someone who mated with a Nephilim many generations down the line, and he's just a giant now. But, I think it's a fascinating thing to talk about because I think it speaks to, especially if you take the Catholic the Catholic view of cosmology, that God is behind every decision made. Well, if that's the case, God was behind the decision of these angels and humans getting together to procreate Nephilim. And if that is true, if it's true in any sense of the word, we have to look at the metaphysical nature of God and how we interact with the world on a much more syncretic and a much more realized view that there is not this necessary separation between the spirit and the physical, that they are bound together.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been bound together since the earliest recordings of human history, which, even though it's, scientifically speaking, it's not an accurate recording of human history, it is still a recording of human history and us trying to explain the world around us and the universe around us.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it fascinating that early Jewish writers, early rabbinic writers always had this idea that God and the physical were combined, that they're not two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Givi is a real exploration of that, because in some cases, like if those were real creatures that were involved in the modern world today,
right,
there are Supermen. There are Supermen. There are Wonder Womans. There are Flashes. They are superheroes. They are our Avengers, our Hawks. In many ways, I think one thing that we miss out, and this is my big conspiracy theory, folks. It's not really a conspiracy theory, but it's something I fully believe. We have forgotten more stories than we know today.
Mm.
So many stories from the human experience, from human civilizations, from human conception, be it mythology or how to grow the best rye in Assyria or wherever it is. We have lost more knowledge than we retain now, and especially stories. And I really do think that there was probably at one point a corpus of stories out there that featured these Nephilim characters going around doing superhero stuff. And, maybe not superhero stuff from the conception of a Bronze Age or Iron Age society.
Yes.
But today, the way we look at it, I think that we look at Captain America, and I'm not trying to compare, folks at home, I'm not trying to compare Captain America to Christ, but I think that we look at certain characters that are the epitome of what we think is moral and ethical good in the absolute. And they have such profound influence on us, be it Christ, be it Krishna, be it Captain America, be it Superman, that there's real power behind this. Like, it's something that shouldn't be taken for granted. And being able to, like you say, have these conversations about it is one of the things I think fantasy is made for. I think fantasy allows us to have these conversations both on the page and internally with ourselves that we necessarily can't within the pews of our church or within the confession box, or even in some cases when we're alone with our own prayers.
Mm-hmm.
I really do think that fantasy gives, and science fiction too has dealt with questions of religion and spirituality very well. I think genre fiction does a very good job of giving us the permission to deal with these subjects.
Yes. Like, the freedom that it gives us to delve into, as you said at the beginning of this podcast, to delve into our interior life.
Yes.
Be that our spiritual or our psychological life, or just that layer, that subconscious layer that we have. It's beautiful. And let's wrap things up. I know there was more that we wanted to talk about, but I wanted to talk about the pear tree and your transcendental fantasy, and we wanted to talk about wrestling. That just means I have to have you back on.
Of course. I'd love to. This has been a great conversation.
How can people find you?
The best place to find me is at jayrequard.com. That's JayRequard. Requard. It's a Alsatian name that takes people some time to get around, but you can find me there at my website. I mostly spend a lot of my time on Threads and Blue Skies these days. You can also find me on Instagram. Everything that you can find me under is under the name Jay Requard. You can also find me on YouTube. I had a show recently called Pondering the Orb that I recently shuttered for a little bit, but I'm also producing a Star Trek fan podcast called Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, which is me and my dad talking about every episode of TNG.
Oh.
Way too seriously, I have to say. But we did it during the pandemic because we wanted to have something for my son to listen to later on, just in case
Oh, my
terrible
heart.
things happen. Yeah, but in case terrible things happen to the pandemic, he could listen to me and his grandfather talk about the thing that we love the most. Star Trek's my favorite thing. It really does inform way too much about me. But you can find me doing that there. But I hope people will check out The Blessed and Possessed, and of course the first book that you're enjoying, The Driver of Serpents.
Well, you can look for my review of that if I continue reading at the pace that I am reading right now, very soon on all of the platforms. Because yeah, and it will be an enthusiastic one, I can assure you. Because
Well, I would really love your take on these books because just knowing your background, I would really love to hear what you think of them because I kind of wrote them for people during the research phase of these books. I talked to a lot of priests. I talked to some people who had been exorcised. And I think one thing that I keep running into when I talk to people who read these books who have come from a life of faith is that they really have fascinating things to say about it. And I
Mhm.
love, people, as much as I make commentary, I would love to hear what people think in terms of what I do right and what I do wrong.
Absolutely. You probably also talk to some weed dealers, judging by the amount of ganja that gets consumed.
That is New York. That is New
I
York. I
assumed.
I just I just put New York in there. Like it is crazy. Now, the thing about being a New Yorker is that you have to decide what trade-off do you want. Do you want everything smelling like weed, or do you want everything smelling like urine? I can tell you, in a post-weed world here in New York, the city
Yes.
smells so much better than it used to, and I'll
Yes.
leave it at that.
And on that note, thank you for your time, and
Absolutely.
we will get you on the schedule for part two of our engaging conversation.
Please do. Thank you, everyone at home.